So let's welcome our guest. And the topic today is the Oklahoma Freedmen of the Five Civilized Tribes. And I'm going to ask each of the guests to introduce themselves and basically what got you going. So I'm going to start with Angela Walton-Raji, and just tell me just a little bit about yourself and your interest in this topic, just to get us going.
Well, thank you. And hello to everyone. My name is Angela Walton-Raji, and I'm originally from Fort Smith, Arkansas, growing up right on the banks of the Arkansas River, which is where Fort Smith is. Actually, it's surrounded by the river, and also on the border of Oklahoma, growing up in a town that is really a border town and historically a frontier town. I grew up with a strong sense of history, and I always knew my great grandmother until she passed away. I was 9 years old when she passed away, and I knew that we were connected to Oklahoma, but we were connected to specifically the Choctaw Nation. What I found out decades after she had passed away, that she was not only a citizen of the Choctaw Nation, but she was a freedman or freedwoman from the Choctaw Nation. And I became intrigued by that history. That was 32 years ago when I learned more of that. And I've been going at it ever since. And I'm still at it.
There you go.
Part of it. So thank you.
Okay, Terry Ligon. Introduce
well, you can
yourself.
say Ligon, but in California we call it Ligon.
Oh,
okay.
okay.
I grew up in Los Angeles in a little community called Watts. As growing up, I had no idea about my family's history. The only grandparents that I knew were my mother's, that I met when I was maybe 4 or 5 years old. So we didn't grow up with this history. No stories were told. I didn't even know the name of my father's mother and father until one day he was feeling mortal and thought he needed to pass down some family heirlooms, and he chose me to be the one with the responsibility to spread this information to all of my brothers and sisters. Little did I know that once I got involved in the research, I would be sharing it with people around the world. I had the pleasure of being in the Indian Affairs Committee hearing. So the mandate to share with my brothers and sisters got a lot wider. And with the publication of this book, it also starts to tell a little bit of the story that he was telling me as an oral history when I would call him on weekends and we'd talk over the phone. And this was before cell phones, boys and girls. And we would just have a general discussion. And I started to learn about this little story he told of his Indian grandmother, which got me intrigued. And I had to begin the process of learning how to conduct genealogical research. And that was maybe 100 years ago.
Oh,
and
100.
Like Angela, I'm still doing it.
Well, thank you for that. Okay, Miss Berna Downing Rogers, please introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. I am Verna Downing Rogers, and I am from Northeast Oklahoma, Chelsea, Oklahoma, Pryor Creek to be exact. I am in the heart of Cherokee Nation. I grew up, I was born and raised there. I was born by a midwife, and my family still own the property that I was born on a few years ago. I became interested in Cherokee Nation, Freedmen, genealogy, probably when I was in my early 20s. And a young gentleman introduced me to the Oklahoma Historical Society in Oklahoma City. I thought he was asking me out on a date, but he just wanted me to go to the Historical Society because I was always talking about my ancestors. And so he told me that I needed to take advantage of that. And I did. And I found all sorts of interesting documents about my family, the Downing family. And matter of fact, it was so interesting in the late 70s when I organized a family reunion we used the Dawes application, and we did a play and a skit from it. And so I've been connected. And 2 weeks before my father passed, he took me on a road trip and shared everything that he'd ever taught us about the family. And so I feel like it is my lot in life to carry on that and make sure that the rest of our descendants, and now all of the people in Oklahoma and the United States, know about their Native American heritage, know about the freedmen, know about the tribes, not just one, but all of them.
Sure, all five. Thank you for that. Angela, I'm going to throw it to you because the topic we're going to talk about today is really going to stem from the book. So would you share your book and about the compulations that's in there, and then we'll go through the questions and go around. But I'd like you to take a couple minutes to share about the book and then, walking through, somewhat of the research process for collecting and contacting individual stories that are featured in the book. And I know we have two of descendants that are also, their stories on their family are in the book. But if you would share about your book, and it's available also on Amazon. And so I'll just let everyone know that. So go ahead, please.
Thank you, Shelley. I appreciate that. The book specifically is Oklahoma Freedmen of the Five Tribes. And this is a compilation of stories from descendants, two of whom are here, really sharing a story. Some chose to talk about their journey, and some really talked about a story from their family's history. My inspiration actually came from a genealogy colleague, many of whom are familiar with Bernice Bennett, who's the author of Black Homesteaders of the South. And this time last year, her book was released, and she kept telling me through that whole process, oh my goodness, Angela, you have all these stories from Indian Territory. You should consider doing something similar. And my first reaction was, yeah, okay, yeah, I agree, yeah. And I just sort of agreed with her, but really did not become proactive. But then finally, I guess I began to really hear what she was saying. And I really appreciated her nudging me. And I didn't know if I would have people who would be willing to share their stories, but I know every time I talk to someone, they share a story with me. And so I put a query first out on Facebook. Are any people out there possibly willing to share a story that could be part of a collection of stories from Indian Territory from freedmen who were at one point either enslaved or their families from the 5 tribal nations that were removed on the Trail of Tears to Oklahoma. So I put in a query on a Facebook group that I monitor, and several people said yes. And then I decided to reach out to others who I knew were from different tribal communities, some Seminoles and Creeks who were not in that initial group, and asked them. But the response was yes, a very strong yes. And so I initially had a planning meeting where it was a Zoom meeting where we just met and talked about the process. And the fact that I was going to be making a proposal to History Press, similar to what Bernice Bennett had done with her book on Black homesteaders. And so I did reach out to them, and they said, well, yeah, we can put you in touch with our Oklahoma guy. And I'm thinking, you have a guy? There's an Oklahoma guy. But I had a wonderful conversation with a gentleman from History Press, and Mr. Ben Gibson, wonderful man who became very, very interested. And to shorten a very long story, they took me seriously. And next thing I know, I had a contract with History Press. And at this point, I realized, oh my gosh, they're also beginning to give me some recommended, no, definite deadlines. have your photos in by December, have your full manuscript by January, mid-January. So then I had to now share with the individuals who are interested in contributing a story these deadlines. If you would like to contribute a story, please do so. This is the deadline, because I had to adjust the photos and put them in the right format that they wanted. And sure enough, I met the December deadline, and then I met the January deadline. And wow, I was just amazed. Within I guess maybe 2 or 3 months later, I want to say 2 months, I actually had a book cover, which is, of course, is the cover that many of you see here.
Yeah.
And I was able to, I'll
It
get
looks
close,
good.
and then
Yeah,
I'll get
back it up. There
so
you
you
go.
can see it in
Right
its
there.
entirety. And I was able, and I did keep in touch with the contributing writers. Yes, once I had the book cover, hey, guess what, folks? We
Yeah.
have a cover. And so it was a process that I learned so much from, working with the mainstream press and History Press, which is part of the Arcadia Publishing Company. And it was something that I was just so thrilled to be able to bring these stories forth. And these are stories that were told by descendants, by the families that are part of these nations. And I was just delighted. And August 7th, the book was released to the public. It was available in the summer for pre-order, but was officially shipped out to people who had pre-ordered, and bookstores that had ordered it were able to put it on the shelf on the 7th of August.
That was exciting, because I was there. I remember we were on camera talking, and your box was delivered. And
oh
so
gosh, I was so thrilled. And it's been just a tremendous experience. And I'm so thrilled that people like Terrian and Verna, who are here today, and others, and 22 others who also contributed stories to really make this book come into fruition. And it's something that I can only say it's just a beginning, because I think I was sharing it with you earlier. There are over 20,700 people who were classified as freedmen from these 5 tribal nations. And yet the only story that you hear coming out of Oklahoma is Black Towns, the Tulsa Massacre, and civil rights, all of which are very important. But there's a 4th story. We're talking about at least 20,000 people who were there decades before the very first Black town was incorporated in the 20th century. And we were there from the years of the Indian migration during the Trail of Tears, the forced removal.
Okay. I got a question.
Yes.
I got a question.
Okay.
And then I'm going to go to Terry and then to Verna. So you were talking about, well, number one, I want you to say the 5 tribes so people will know.
Yes.
But also when you're talking about freedmen of the 5 civilized tribes, what that sounds like to me is that these folks you're talking about were enslaved by these Indian tribes.
Correct.
So if you can clarify who the 5 tribes are, and then you also mention the Trail of Tears.
Yes.
If you can give us a brief comment on that, and then I want to take a question to Terry.
Okay. The 5 tribes specifically are Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Muskogee Creek, and Seminole Nations. And during the years of the removal, the Indian removal, known by many as the Trail of Tears, what is the general story that is recognized is people removed from the Southeast, leaving their homeland and going west, and many people lost their lives, and it was a very painful process. What is frequently not mentioned, that there were many, many people who were enslaved by many members of those 5 nations. Now, I will make an exception. The Seminole story is a little bit different. Theirs is a little bit, their history is a bit unique in terms of how those Black people became involved with Seminoles. They became allies. They became colleagues, some of them certainly individuals who traveled as Seminoles, not all as enslaved people. But within the other four nations, we are talking Black chattel slavery. These are people who were Southerners. They were from the Southeast. They were called at one point in time the Five Civilized Tribes. Civilized because in many ways their contact had become very early to the colonists. They had adapted many of the colonists' ways. At one time, those who were hunters and gatherers suddenly became agrarians. They became farmers and organized systems of farming. They became Christian, many did, and many of them had embraced another practice of people in the South, Black chattel slavery. And so many people did take enslaved people with them on the trail. And you can see some of those emigration rolls, that's emigration with an E, not an I, some of those census rolls that were recorded prior to removal. And you see numbers of enslaved people going with people who were part of those nations. And of course, as the years progress, we're talking 1830s, up until the late 1840s, there were some still trickling westward in the 1850s, but the forced removal, the most painful part, came in that early section between 1830 and 1840, the removal of 5 tribal nations. And fast forward 20 or so years, keeping in mind that these five nations signed an alliance with the Confederate States of America and fought for the South in the Civil War. And there are over 24 Indian regiments, Native American regiments that were Confederates. There were only 3 Union regiments that were from Indian Territory, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Indian Home Guards. But we're talking about Southerners, and where, of course, these tribes had their place of origin. That was their homeland. So I don't know if I answered all your questions.
Yeah, you got that, and thank you for that. And also that triggers things when you commented about chattel slavery, this, that, and other. And I'm gonna turn to Terry, but I also want to make clear, and this is a yes or no response, we're also talking about possibly buying and selling along the way. People are dying also on the way. And I'm thinking of what we know as slavery in the South in the United States of America. All that other stuff was also going along with this migration from, okay. All right. Terry. All right. Thank you for that. And I hope people, because a lot of people don't understand this.
I know.
And we're also talking about money, economics. We're talking about labor. So, okay, Terry, now your personal connections to the stories that's in the book, can you share with us how this connections influenced your approach about compiling the stories that you included, and who were they to you, the stories that you wrote about?
He's muted.
Yes.
It was difficult for me to choose one story. I wanted to do more, but I was juggling a lot of different things, so I was hard pressed to come up with one. And I thought the origin story of my research process was probably a good one. It had a lot of imagery in it for me and other people, and I thought it served as a lesson for people who do research and begin with absolutely no knowledge of their own history. And so for me, it began with the heirlooms my father presented me with in this big old Costco paper towel box, and just jam-packed with pictures and letters and stuff. And then he said, well, I want you to save this stuff and share with your brothers and sisters. And so I was reluctant to do it at first. I can recall my sister even asking me, helping her with some genealogical stuff, and I just didn't want to touch it. Because I think, like a lot of people, when you mention slavery, it's something we run from as opposed to run to. And so, as I said earlier, I began these conversations with my father about his ancestry. And when he started telling me about his Indian grandmother, I said, well, here's another black man trying to be something other than black.
Right.
You know,
Right.
so
No, it's a common theme.
yeah,
We hear it.
yeah,
Yes.
you know, everybody's got an Indian grandmother with hair down to her butt and all this kind of stuff. So,
Yeah.
you know, I was reluctant. But then I started to hear more about these stories and it kind of caught me. And so as I went through the pictures, and if you allow me to share my screen,
Sure.
um, I'm going to deviate because I want to show you something that you and Angela would talk about. When we talk, and you talk about the 5 civilized tribes, I like to refer to them as the 5 slaveholding tribes.
Okay.
Because when we talk about these tribes, I think that gets lost in a lot of the conversation. They were slave owners, they profited from it, they fought a war for it, and yet it's missing from the narrative a lot of the times. And what I'm showing here, if you can see it, this is an immigration roll. And if you look at it, you'll see when they talk about the Trail of Tears, there were more people of African Native descent that traveled on that road than there were Native Americans. And their story gets lost in that. Okay, but
Yes.
we can come back to this. I just wanted you to see that.
Thank you for that. That actually is very critical to what you just said.
Because now, when I was looking at these images in this box my father gave me, this can you see this image of this is his grandmother?
Yes.
This is the one he said that was his Indian grandmother. So when I looked at it, I said, well, she doesn't look exactly black. You know? So maybe there's some truth to his story, you know. And so I was working in a photo lab doing large color prints and all this stuff. And I knew I was going to quit in a year. So I started making copy negs of everything I could because I had the facility to myself. And when I wanted to take a picture of this in the frame, the glass would give off a glare. I couldn't use it that way. So I took it out of the frame, and behind it was this picture.
Okay. Margaret Ann Wilson. Okay.
Exactly. Now, my father at first told me her name was Sally Christian because that's the only relative he knew of. And so I went with that information for a couple of years thinking it was Sally Christian until I started seeing documents. And then a document that I found was a Dawes card of the first woman, Betty. On the rear of it, it listed her mother and father, and her mother was Margaret Ann Wilson. Okay, so I continued to do more research through the years. This is when I first became acquainted with Angela, who was probably, no, she was the only person online before Facebook, before YouTube, before TikTok that knew anything about this history.
Sounds like AOL to me.
Yeah, you know, before Afrogenius.
Yes, Afrogenius too.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so she started telling me, and stupid me, I didn't realize that Oklahoma was Indian territory before 1907. So I'm looking for Oklahoma records to find these people and could never find them anywhere. But after having a few discussions with Angela, I learned that, you know, maybe I should look at that roll of film that says Indian territory. Sure. Okay. Yeah. And so I started discovering the family through some of the documents. But one of the documents that I found that was essential to a lot of search and the history behind this woman was this. This is an application for citizenship in the Chickasaw Nation by her daughter, Betty. And when that story of my father talking about his Indian grandmother, here was the evidence that he knew as an 8-year-old child listening to grown folks' stories behind a closed door on the other side of a wall. Okay, so
absolutely.
Along the way, the story got twisted and turned, but there was still a kernel of truth in it. And that kernel of truth was enabling me to find all of this documentation that I was not aware of. And it told me about his Indian grandmother and her mother, who told the story that she came to Indian territory with Colonel Benjamin Love, a Chickasaw Indian. Okay, so again, we come back to that removal story, that Trail of Tears story. And when people talk about it, they talk about the pain, the suffering, and all the anguish that went in with the tribes. And there was plenty of that. But they never tell you the story about the pain, the anguish, and the African tears left upon that same trail. And one of the persons who left those tear stains was Margaret Ann Wilson. And so with this, I felt that this was the first story I needed to tell in probably a trilogy of stories that I intend to tell. And
It's
so,
just amazing.
yeah, it's amazing to me that the history
Well,
is so
it's
unique, so
amazing because you're
documented.
calling out records, number one. You also recognize the photograph as well. So those folks that are listening, that are tuning in, these are leads for you right now. There's
Yes.
Dawes records out there. There's an application process. And don't forget the photographs. And number one, don't forget the stories that might come down your family from generation to
If I
generation.
might add, Shelley,
Sure.
I think the process of going through this, we don't realize it at the time, but we are called upon to wear a lot of hats,
Yes.
to do a lot of different researching in a lot of different places. I had to figure out a way to get into a law library because they wouldn't allow non-lawyers to get into it, to look for
Right.
documents. I had to get back into the library research that I had been accustomed to as a kid, because my nickname as a kid was Professor. Okay.
I love
So
it.
I was a nerd at an early age.
We got a new title for you, Terry.
Yeah. And so, but it felt so comfortable doing research because I was accustomed to it. And so
Absolutely.
I had to learn the law. I had to learn the congressional record. I had to learn the Dawes records. And so in the years of doing this research, I picked up a lot of other knowledge that I didn't have. I had an awareness for history I did not have. And I had an appreciation for that slavery story that was not one of that was detrimental, but it was empowering. Because as we go through these stories, we tell these histories, we write these books, it empowers us to tell that story of those ancestors who did not have that power.
And that's critical again, that we have to tell these stories.
Oh, yeah.
The good and the bad. And so
Yes.
now I'm going to turn over to Verna, and I'll ask you pretty much the same question. What about the personal connections to the stories that you have in the book? And if so, how did these connections influence your approach about you compiling that story?
Oh, wow. Personal connection, I'm sorry. It is me. I felt like I was literally drawn to, and I wrote a story about All Roads Lead to Sarah, because I had been focused on, since the 70s, looking for my Downing relatives, because we all know Downing is a Cherokee name. And so I could easily find Downing information, and so I was focused on learning more about my great-great-grandfather Reuben Downing, who supposedly oral history has it came over on the Trail of Tears. I have not found that documented. However, I was focused on him. However, as I was researching, going through the census records, going through the Dawes records, going, just any and every record I could find, calling Angela a bunch.
Yes.
And everything I could find to find more information about Reuben Downing. But every time I was searching for Reuben, I would go down the rabbit hole to Sarah and Martin. And then, of course, we started taking DNA. And so I took every DNA I could find, and all of my relatives were leading me to Sarah and Martin. And they had a Downing connection as well. And so when my father and I took that last journey, every place we stopped was a place that Sarah and Martin had touched. She had a connection there. She had lived there. She had ministered to someone there. She had helped a family there, birthed a baby, something, everything always led to Sarah and Martin. So I said, well, wait a minute. Why is Sarah Ann is calling me? She's calling my name. And I started looking at, much like Terry, looking at some old photos and I'm going, well, here's my dad, here's his father, here's his brother. Who are these other people? Only to find out some of the other people were my grandmother and my great grandmother, Sarah Ann, no, Mary, and then not a picture of Sarah Ann, but my great grandmother and my great great grandmother. And so, but all of the roads led back to Sarah Ann Martin. And so as a result, I felt like, okay, I've got to dig a little deeper into this woman. I've got to see the connection. And I felt like, okay, pretty much she's calling me. She's calling me to look into her children. She's calling me to look at her grandchildren. And as of now, I've met people all over the United States who are connected to me through Sarah Ann Martin.
That's amazing.
It is amazing. And I love it. And I remember, and Terry and Angela have heard me say this many a times, my father never lied to me. And he would tell us stories about the family. And so I made it a mission to start researching those stories, finding solid evidence, finding documentation of what he had told me. And one of the stories he had told us was about Aunt Sarah Ann. Now, I just assumed Aunt Sarah Ann was his aunt. But I thought it was kind of odd since he did not have an aunt in Reuben's records, Sarah Ann. And so, but I went with it because he never lied to me. And I started researching his oral story that he told me about Aunt Sarah Ann Martin, that when they moved to Mexico, my father was raised in Mexico. And so he went at a very young age. He received his Dawes enrollment at age 3. So, and his brother at age 5. And so shortly after that, they moved to Mexico, and he did not return until he was a teenager. And so while they were in Mexico, they had Aunt Sarah Ann watching their land allotments. And he always told the story. Well, the white man, they took and swindled Aunt Sarah Ann out of the land allotments. And matter of fact, on that last journey, we went and traveled the roads that the land was on. And so then I ran across a newspaper article about Aunt Sarah Ann Martin.
Oh my goodness.
Who was my great great grandmother, the woman my father spoke about, how she had been murdered and strangled. And some of my younger relatives say, was she hung? I said, I don't know. I don't have that. But we know that she was murdered, and we know that she was murdered for the land because she was overseeing land for her daughter, her granddaughter, her 2 grandsons. And so she was overseeing all this property, and she was murdered. And so in the newspaper article, it talked about her funeral procession, how it was the largest funeral procession in Pryor Creek, which is in Northeast Oklahoma, Cooey District, Chelsea, Rock County. Yeah. And how she was buried on property that had been donated by her parents, their land allotment. And it said all of her family was there except one daughter and the daughter's family who was in Mexico, verifying the stories that we had heard, the oral history. And so, and the cemetery still stands. Sarah Ann Martin's headstone was one of the largest headstone in that cemetery, even though her parents were buried there, and her children and other ancestors. Hers was always, when you came through the gate, you could see Sarah Ann Martin's headstone. And even individuals that did not know the connection or how she was connected to that cemetery, they would always gather to her headstone and want to know more about Sarah Ann Martin. And so
sounds like she was calling you. Number
me.
one.
Yes,
Yes.
she definitely called me. And
Yeah.
the great thing about this is the cemetery where Sarah Ann Martin is buried, where my father is buried, where his father is buried, is on my father and his brother and his mother's land allotment. They are literally buried pretty much on their land allotment, part of their land, not all of it. And around that cemetery is where other relatives' land allotments were. In Chelsea, Oklahoma, Rogers County.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to deviate. I'm going to deviate a little bit from the questions, but first I want to mention the last name Downing is a very prominent name in Northumberland County, Virginia. They are white and they are a large slaveholding family. So I'm going to just leave that over there. I don't know if you know of that connection, but I have done research in that county and very aware of that county. And the Downings was one of the big families. So now I'm going to get some clarification, and I hope this helps. So Angela, I heard the Dawes records. I heard allotment, land allotment. Can you explain and I know I don't, I know there's an application that people had to go through, but can you share with us about, and again, people that are thinking about doing to find out if they have any freedmen, or any connection to any of these nations. What is it that we need to know? What is a Dawes? And did everybody get this land? Because she said 3 years old. So that's telling me children also received land. So can you take a couple minutes and explain to us? Because I think this would help people, because I'm going to run to Ancestry and I'm going to go look up a roll. But wait a minute, there's more than one roll and so forth. So I'm going to turn it over to you. And I see you're sharing the screen. So thank you. If you'll explain this.
Okay, that is Terry sharing the screen at the present time.
Sorry. Okay,
so up there. Since he knows that I'm going to be talking about it. Thank you, Terry.
Thank you.
First of all, understand what the Dawes process was about. If you can stop share just for a moment, Terry, then I'll ask you to put that back up. The Dawes allotment process was the result of a motion or a bill that was put in Congress by a senator from Massachusetts. Senator Henry Dawes put out the proposal of course, keep in mind, westward expansion was still underway. And, people are looking west, and we've got to bring in some of these Western territories into the Union and to form more states. Well, it was decided that in order to do that, we had these treaties that we had given this land to these tribes, and it was decided, well, let's allot lands to everybody who can we determine will be eligible to receive an allotment of land. And after the lands are allotted, the remaining millions and millions of acres would then be open for white settlement, and a new state can be formed. So many people don't think or do not know that the Dawes process was not a membership process. These are people who are already citizens and living in the tribal nations where they had been for decades.
And we're talking about white, and we're talking about Indians and blacks.
I'm talking specifically about these 5 tribal nations: Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Muskogee Creek, and Seminole Nations. But the decision was, through the Dawes Act, to allot lands to everybody who was there, everyone, including infants, children as well. And but once everybody got a parcel of land, then the acres would be open. The remaining millions of acres would form a new state. Now, it is important to understand that this allotment of land was altering the culture. Within the tradition of these nations, land was always held in common. It was owned by everyone. If you were my next door neighbor, my cow could go graze in your pasture, your cows could come graze in mine. But now this new concept of private parcels of land, put up a fence. Now you are trespassing if you come onto my land without permission. This idea of parceling off land was going to dramatically alter the culture of 5 tribal nations where land had been held in common. Oh. So at this point, it was determined, let's create a roll of people who would be deemed eligible to receive their allotment. That process took more than a decade, from 1898 until 1914, when the rolls were finally closed and everybody had been interviewed and everyone had received allotments. Now, it wasn't always fair. Now, in 3 of the 5 tribes, everyone got an equal number of acres, whether it was 120 acres or whether it was 160 acres, depending upon the tribe that you're in. But the exception were Choctaws and Chickasaws, who gave their citizens by blood, which is another discussion, because there were plenty of people who were classified as tribal freedmen who had the blood of their fathers, they had been fathered by Native men, right, who had children with some of those enslaved women. But that's a different discussion. It was decided in those 2 nations who had signed the same treaty. Other tribes had signed their individual treaties, but Choctaws and Chickasaws were joint on this, that freedmen would get 40 acres of land each. Now, if you're a family of 10 people, well, that's a big parcel, 400 acres of land. Not bad for, right, certainly a family. However, if you were on the blood roll, now your blood is being recognized, which it was not recognized for those classified as freedmen. You got 8 times more land. You got 320 acres. So if it's a family of 10, now they have over 3,000 acres that they had in their family, different opportunities to establish generational wealth. However, again, that's still a different discussion. The fact is that, however, everyone did get parcels of land. Now, Terry just put up a document. If you could put that back up, Terry, I appreciate that. There are 5 tribal nations, so there are 5 different categories of records, just with the Dawes records. These are created between 1898 and 1914. You see here, you see a mother and a son, but I want you to look at that. First of all, you see Choctaw Nation, you see Freedmen Roll, you see a card number 1301, you see they lived along the Red River in Red River County, and they lived in Shawneetown. But look at the people. You see Middleton Carter, who is 68 years old, and look at the next name, his mother, who was 100 years old. If you look at the bottom right-hand corner, you see the date they appeared was in April of 1899. So Nancy Carter was born in 1799.
Oh,
this is more than 30-something years before removal, because the Choctaws began their removal in 1830. They were the first of the 5 nations to be removed west in 1830 after the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit was signed. And here is a woman who was
But didn't I just see slave owner there?
Yes, you did. Pull it back up, Terry, before, if you can. Over to the right, you see that the slaveholder of both Middleton and his mother, Nancy, was a woman called Susie Jones. But let me talk about the Jones. This is the family of Robert M. Jones, who is known historically as the wealthiest slaveholder in Indian Territory. If one is to look at the 1860 slave schedule, and if you look in Red River County and you see the slaves people who were held enslaved by R.M. Jones or Robert M. Jones. This man had over 4 farms just within one tribal jurisdiction in the Choctaw Nation. He held other lands also. He held other people enslaved across the state line in Texas and other places. Now, of course, obviously, if you look, and Terry is now showing the back of that card. Now, the front of the card, we saw Nancy, and we saw her son, Middleton. Now, on the back of the card, their lines number 1 and 2. Line number 1 was Middleton. His father was a man called Bill Carter, who was deceased by that time because he's 68 years old. But we now know the name of the father of this man, whose name is on the front, was a man called Bill Carter, and who was also enslaved by the same Jones family. We know his mother is Nancy. Nancy's name is on the front of the card. So, of course, that is his mother because she was still alive.
Correct.
So, now if we look at Nancy, Nancy was born in Alabama. Well, there's the western edge of Alabama is a little bit of spillover of Choctaw territory. They're mostly from Mississippi, but spilling over a little bit into Alabama. She was born in Alabama. But she herself did not know. Now, of course, she herself didn't make the journey to appear and talk, but the name of her father is not recorded. But guess what? If she was born in 1799, we now know the name of her mother, who was Charlotte Colbert, and she had been enslaved by a person called George Colbert. And this is going back to the late 1700s in the Choctaw communities in our community in Western Alabama.
This is amazing.
And this is just one of the many records. And I want to emphasize just one thing. People who descend from individuals who are on the Dawes roll, they are among the most documented people who claim, oh, we're part Indian, we're part this, we're part that. Well, if you're a freedman descendant from a family from Oklahoma, the records abound. Now, Terry is just showing now an allotment map. Now, if you recall, when we were looking at that record, and we had Nancy Carter, who was there, and I see someone, oh yeah, has some Colberts in her family.
I see that, yeah.
That's good. But what we're seeing, though, is an allotment package. This is when the lands were being allotted. And of course, if you zoom in right where his mouth is on the right, you see some information that's there, and you get a legal description of the land. We're talking about Section 24, Township 8 South, and Range 23 East. Well, the National Archives, thankfully, has put up allotment maps. And if one is to look at the map, you should be able to zoom in on Section 24, Township 8 South, and Range 23 East. And let's see, what was her roll number? Because on many of these maps,
4178, I believe.
I'm sorry?
4178, I think I saw.
4178. So if you notice on some of these maps, you see numbers. You see names of some people and some places. Yes, 4178. So if you look very closely, and of course we know it's Section 24, 8 South, and Range 23. So it's Section 24, right where his mouse is roaming. You see that. And of course, I think that I'm not sure if you can outline exactly how far that township is showing up, but we do see at a certain point in terms of different individuals, and you will start to see the different roll numbers that are appearing. Now, hold on a second. I see 4176. I see. Say it again.
I don't see her allotment here.
I see that's 4076.
You know why?
Is that the right range?
I have the wrong one.
You have the wrong map. He'll put it up in a second. Because on the maps, you will start to see exactly where the land is, because the purpose of the Dawes roll is land. And so it is very important that you realize this is the purpose. So for everyone who has a card that looks like the card that had Nancy's name on it, you will find a map that's going to show where her land was. Now, we know plenty of people lost their land. I think Verna shared with us, Sarah lost her land, and there are many people who lost their land due to all kinds of trickery and all kinds of other things that were going on in Oklahoma, especially after land allotment. The idea of so many of these freed people owning land, it was decided, do what we can do to get it from them. And that did happen in many, many cases. So let's see, is this the correct map?
Correct map.
Okay.
4178 is,
and it's section
there it is, C.
24.
Nancy Carter. I see it right there with a C. Nancy Carter E4178.
There we go.
Yeah, right on the side there. I see it.
I see
and so you're
right
also, yes. And you're
blow it up. Can you blow that up, Terry? If you can. Okay, there's her land allotment.
Okay. And that's the 40 acres.
That's the 40 acres.
Right there.
But I got a question. Who owns this land that they're allotting out?
At the time when the allotment was occurring, the tribe owned all the land in common. They're now parceling off pieces of land, saying, okay, you're going to own this much, and you're going to own this much, you're going to own this much. And if you notice on that map, some parcels of land were much bigger than 40 acres. Yeah. Because she was a freedman, they gave her only 40. But you saw larger parcels; those were citizens by blood. So, in other words, your blood composition see those. You see some very large squares that are there.
Yeah, the yellow is and some red are larger.
Exactly.
Okay, so that would bring in blood, and could that also represent more people?
But every person on any card got a parcel of land. But you always see their roll number on and it shows you per parcel number 4182. You maybe got a larger parcel of land. But every person in the house,
everybody gets land, and I'm struggling a little bit. Yeah, I'm struggling a little bit when I think about. I hate calling it regular slavery, but when I'm thinking of African Americans who were enslaved or even became free, there's no just land given out. And I understand the difference that we've got nations that had this land and so forth. And in the case of Verna, her family person lost their land, but did they get that land back?
Some families did and some did not, and some still have no access to it now because it's changed hands over the last century.
Okay, so we're hearing again Dawes land allotments, and we're talking about everybody getting this land. So for each of you now, and thank you for clarifying about the Dawes, and I know there's tons of Dawes, I mean different roles that are out there. And I'm assuming that attaches with nations also. And people had somebody mentioned about interviews. Is that part of the application process? And then I want to go to challenges from Verna and also Terry and you as well. But the application process and the interviews, I have seen some of these interviews, and I'm going to say from a previous book that you had, and I've seen these applications. So will you comment on that for us?
Yes. Well, understand that card had to be filled out. It wasn't filled out by the persons applying to get on this land eligibility roll. Somebody had to say, what's your name? How old are you? Where are you from? Oh, were you a slave? Who was your slave owner? Those interviews represent those conversations that were had when they sat down at that table. And as you see right now, I think it's slipped off the screen there. But some of these interviews are very detailed, and it's absolutely amazing to see some of the data that you actually get with them. So that's part of it. But I want to mention one more thing about records.
Mhm.
The Dawes process, 1898 to 1914. But there are records for many people. For example, in the Cherokee Nation, they wanted to know where were you on the 1880 roll of authenticated Cherokee citizens. So you see that sometimes on a Dawes card. With Choctaw Freedmen, are you on the 1896 roll? You'll also see with people
So
who are
they're
from the
referencing even more
other census
documentation,
records,
other information.
other census records that existed, which is why I always say those who descend from freedmen of these five nations are among the most documented Black people in this country. Because if you look at a standard census record, you get that one page where grandma and grandpa appear in 1930 or 1910 or 1880, but you don't get a conversation like this. Questions and answers. What is your name? What's your post office? How old are you? How long have you lived in this town? All kinds of detail. Who are your parents? Are they living? Are they dead? Is your husband alive? Do you have children? You get the conversation. But this is just one set.
Which is almost a genealogy chart.
It's amazing.
Of information. Yes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And these records go back as early as post-Civil War. 1867 is the earliest post-Civil War record that I have found, and I'm continually bumping into other records. But we are among the most documented people who claim that we have a tie to any of the tribal nations, and it just goes on and on. And
why do we not know this?
Good question. And yes,
and researching African American in United States, or what has become the United States, has its challenges, and we all know that, and especially those that do this professionally and so forth. And this is a whole nother segment of information. And I think Terry made comment too that these are stories that are not told. You got a small segment of a population of people, and I will say from the East Coast out to Indian Territory, which becomes Oklahoma. But you also have people on the way, you know, that either get sold, or they die. They're dying, and now you got people in Oklahoma that know people might have been born in South Carolina, might have been born in Virginia, wherever it is. But again, the challenges, and I will say this, does the challenges because we don't want to know, or certain people don't want to know this story? And I'm going to go to Verna first, Terry, because I see you. And tell me just give me a couple statements about the challenges that you've come across in your research doing this, and then I'm gonna take it to Terry, then Angela.
The challenges is simply everybody do not want their story out there.
Okay.
Some people do not want to know that they are second cousin to a Downing that looks like a Verna.
Okay.
When they have lived a life of saying, well, I'm a proud Native American and of Chief so-and-so, and then there's Verna, who is connected to them. That's a challenge.
That's a challenge. And of course, information, but we're hearing about records, because on the African American side, and I'm going to just say on the regular African American side, not tied to a nation, it's about access. And so now I'm going to throw it to Terry. Challenge.
I'm so glad you did. Well, I think I come from a different point of view because I didn't grow up with this information.
Okay.
And so when I look at it and try to analyze it, I look at it from political, social aspects. Not that I even studied that, but by researching the records, you kind of get the sense of what's going on. And I think one of the reasons why you asked the question, it's not well known, is because it doesn't fit the typical narrative of Native Americans. And when you talk about oppression of another people, and their story is how graceful they are, how oppressed they were, how much harm has been done to them, this story doesn't fit well. It's kind of like an irritant. And when you read some of the actual documents, you see the racial animus from many in those tribes and their supporters during that time. You had an entire Oklahoma congressional delegation go to Congress and fight for these people having the same rights as a Native American would, except for one man. Okay. And they beat him down because he was supporting freedmen. So you have the issues of natural resources and minerals that are being exploited in this territory. It's not a nice story for people who want to keep that hush hush. You have the politics and the legal fights that go on from Oklahoma with the first legislation passed, the Jim Crow law. You have all of these elements that are really vying for attention. This story doesn't fit well. And for me, it's a microcosm of the United States in its history of racism. And within this little small 5 slaveholding tribes. And so for that story to be told, you're going to have to rub some people the wrong way. Absolutely. And they're not having it.
And we're seeing this also just in the African American, not attached to a native tribe.
And that's another good question, because I've been asking for years, why isn't it in the African American Museum?
Right.
Okay. Because are we not part of that diaspora?
Right.
Are you not in the
people.
Native American Museum in DC?
No, the tribes don't want. I give Chief Hoskins of the Cherokee Nation a lot of credit, because the man took a huge step doing what he did to accept freedmen back into that nation, according to the principles of the Reconstruction Treaty of 1866. He's put his neck on the line for doing something that is just. And it's one of the articles or books I'm trying to work on. Justice does not have a timepiece to it.
No.
Okay. We're still trying to receive justice for these ancestors who did not get it. Because Angela's already told you that we don't have a shortage of records. We have a shortage of truth. Okay.
Oh,
and we have
that's
a shortage
powerful.
of exposure.
That's
people,
powerful.
Yeah, people don't want to know these stories because it's not what you've been taught. It's not what you've been led to believe.
Right.
But it's factual. Anything I ever put up there, I can back it up with a document.
And it's critical thinking about this, because another aspect of the challenge, and I'll head this towards Angela. Number one, you're talking about Native American. Number two, you're also talking about white America. Number three, you're talking about Black America. All of that represents a challenge. And this is something, it's almost like it's been buried per se. And is it because in my world, land was always, in the research I do, land was always the one thing that if you can get land, you've made it. And this was the pride of ownership and things like that. So Angela, any different challenges besides the access and what we've heard from Verna and Terry that you want to pass on?
Well, I will just say, one of two. Well, I'll say two things. One, of course, I think Terry's already addressed it. Of the story, or our story, doesn't fit with the larger narrative. Oh, these poor oppressed people who lost their land. Universal sympathy given to people who lost their land, didn't hurt anybody. They were here, and here come these colonists, and within 150 years, push them off the land and get out the way. But the part that's not that doesn't fit the narrative, these oppressed people also embrace the oppression of another people. They bought into slavery.
Sure.
They fought to preserve slavery. And in looking at least two of those 5 nations who said, okay, well, we'll give you some, but you're not going to get as much because your blood is not quite as pure as our blood. Apartheid in Indian territory. That does not fit with the general narrative of universal sympathy that is given. That's number one. Number two, the other challenge is that today in the 21st century, we now have people creating false narratives, false history, inventing things. So we were here 55,000 years before Columbus. Have you seen those Olmec statues? You know, one statue in a country, not in North America, that they're using to paint a paintbrush. And that challenge is coming from some within our circle. This is a new spin created by us. Yet we have documents to prove who they are, and multiple documents that go back to, if Tara, if you could pull up that one immigration roll again of the Chickasaws who were going west, that muster roll, because we can prove that we also suffered during that removal. And the challenge is that we've got now people espousing just stuff that they're making up. And Terry and I were both present on Capitol Hill last summer when several people spoke and addressed the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs. And what was interesting, people were invited later. If you have a letter, would like to contribute, submit it. It will become a part of the congressional record. Many of us did write letters who are from the Freedmen diaspora, from the community. But this is that challenge again from people with this strange history. There were people writing letters from tribes that don't exist. Oh, I am the grandmother of the dripping springs of the running water of the sunny moonbeam, and we are part, and don't cancel the treaty. That was not the purpose of the meeting. People were writing letters from these made up communities that consist of Black people, addressing something that meeting did not even contain. There was no discussion about canceling a treaty. That was not the purpose of that discussion or that meeting. And to sort of finally, as people talk about being here 55,000 years before Columbus, who lost his way, over in the right column under remarks, look at Jackson Kemp, well-known Chickasaw family. But over to the right, look at that. A Negro boy died on the 24th of November. This is a record of a child who died on the Trail of Tears. And at the very bottom, that last entry, a Negro girl died on the 17th of December. We too suffered and died. But did their parents get a chance to cry for their loss when they're busy carrying some of the parcels being taken and moved to the West? Did they have time to weep over that child who died? And these are the challenges. Part of the challenges, omission of the history from the soil that became Oklahoma. The other part, people making things up from the African-American family. And yet we who can truly prove with thousands of pages of records still are having our voices silenced. That is our trap.
Let me help a sister out, Shelley.
That's
That's why that book is important.
I think we just hit. That was the next question, and to kind of shut this down to come to the Q&A is the fact that since the release of the book, you know, and as it gets out there, and we've got researchers, you know, in the audience and things like that, and again, we want it to fit into the larger narrative of Black history. We don't want this left out. And this is just an example of how important this book, a very small example of important. But think about this, since the release of the book, and this is for all three of you, I'm going to say, you know, kind of on final words per se, and then we'll go to any questions. But since the release of the book, what kind of impact or reception have you personally observed, and particularly among maybe other descendants of freedmen or the broader Oklahoma community, if
Yeah.
there has been any. I know that's a big one, but I think, and I'm going to go with Terry first, and then Verna, and then Angela, I'll bring it back to you and wrap that up with some future endeavors. But Terry, since the release of this book, what is going on? Anything?
I've seen an uptick in the interest, people taking a little
Okay.
bit more interest. I keep my nose to the grindstone because I'm not getting any younger. You
Sure.
know, I'm 13 going on 71.
Yes.
And so there are some very important stories I need to tell.
Yes.
Okay. And so for me, that's been kind of my focus. Or as Angela would like to tell you, you came from underneath the rock today just to, so she could see me and talk to me.
Right.
But and she had to take me kicking and screaming just to do this little story that I wrote, which I think I need to go back and really clean up. Okay, but that's another story. But I think it's personal that I'm inspired to want to do more. I want to talk about those invisible people on the Trail of Tears, of which I can pretty much tell you I can identify at least 500, and if you include their deceased parents, maybe close to 1,000 people who were on the Trail of Tears. Okay? I need to talk about those individuals who are considered African native, who are left off the rolls, who didn't get their 320 acres of land, who filed a lawsuit over $20 million, which would be close to $500 million today. That story needs to be told.
Sure.
Okay? And then there's the communities of freedmen who don't get the same respect that Tulsa and the all Black towns do. But they were there way before those towns. And those individuals, it may not be a metropolitan area, it may not be a large city, but it's just as important to tell that story because it goes into what created Oklahoma. What was Oklahoma, Indian Territory all about? What stories? Because we're at a loss for some of their history because they didn't keep a diary of their travels on the road. If it was not for that little footnote of the little boy dying, the little girl dying, you really
you wouldn't even know.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so it's hard to reproduce those stories, but we can still tell their story through their legacy. And that's what I'm trying to do is that anybody that lived to be 100 years old has got to be recognized.
And they have to be remembered.
Exactly.
They have to be Verna.
Yes, ma'am.
What have you seen since the release of this book? You got family stuff up in this book.
I know. And since the release of the book, I have been so excited because people are coming forward. They're wanting more information. They want more stories like what's in this book. They're already saying, when's the next one coming out? So they're excited. And so it gives me an opportunity to share with them. Yes, we need more stories. We need more families to come forward and tell their stories because every family story is unique. Every family story is so different from Verna's story. But it is nonetheless, it is still very important. And so I've seen a great support. And I'm very pleased about that. And the descendant of the Freedmens, I'm calling out the young people. I'm saying, come forward. We need the younger people because I'm 2 days younger than Terry. And we need younger people to come forward and keep it going and keep this going. They have more energy and they have better with the technology than we are. And so I'm calling them out, and everyone
call them out.
Call them out. Get on board. Get on board. Come on. I've started me an Instagram page, and they're going, "What, Auntie? You have an Instagram page?" Yes, and you're going to teach me how to work it. And because we have to get the information out, and we've got to let them know it's okay. It's okay to tell your stories, but more importantly than that, all the people that have signed up to become citizens of their tribe, and that was accepted as citizens, they need to vote. They need to register to vote, and they need to vote, because I say it all the time. Sometimes we're only as good as the chief.
Mm.
You know, Chief Hoskins is an awesome chief. And I say, no, he may be 3 days younger than Terry. I don't know. But we need to vote. We need to make
the voice has got to be heard.
The voices have got to be heard. And I'm not a politician. I don't even want to be in politics. But I do stress to every descendant of freedmen that you need to register to vote, and you need to vote. And as my father used to always tell us, you need to study the people that you vote into office. You need to study what their policy is, and so that you can vote appropriately. And so, but yeah,
wonderful,
overwhelming.
Great messages, you guys, just great messages. Angela, so closing this out for this, any plans for future projects? What's your reaction, or how's the reaction towards the book coming out? And hopefully the Center for Family History has played a small part on putting this history out in this book, you know, that we have this opportunity. But are there future projects or endeavors that people are looking at the history and stories of these freedmen? And I'm going to say of Oklahoma, but I also think of freedmen all the way along the way, you know, and they end up in Indian territory that becomes Oklahoma. So I'm going to turn it to you, and then I'm going to go to Whitney and check and see if there's any questions. So we'll be wrapping this up. You know.
Well, thank you. I will certainly say that, yes, there are some projects underway right now. I know Terry is busy writing a book, as is Verna. She is writing a book about her ancestral community. And so, yes, there are other things underway. And I am currently writing another book on the Choctaw County, Scullyville County, which was part of the Mushlatubbee district, northern part of the Choctaw Nation. And I'm writing a book about the freedmen from Scullyville. So yes, there are other books that are in process.
Now, Scullyville's where Grandma Sally's from, right?
Sam and Sally, yes.
I remember Sally, yes. Okay.
And I'm about halfway through, maybe a little bit more than half, but so I'm hoping this time next year I will be working again with History Press on the second book. So that's my hope anyway. But since the book has been published, and just addressing that question, I have a cousin in Northwest Arkansas. Both Verna and Terry know him, cousin Jerry, up in Bentonville, Arkansas, which again, that's Western Arkansas. It's still on the Oklahoma border. And he shared a story with me when he went into one of the museums, the local area museums, the Native American Museum. And he takes the book with him, and he'll just say, "Hey, do you have this book?" And so they were like, "No, what is this?" And of course, they had no idea. This is a Native American museum, part of what was the old Cherokee Nation, and even in the years prior to the Civil War. But what is interesting, they were interested and said they were going to order books. He went out to the parking lot and shared. There was a lady getting out of her car. "Have you seen this book?" And he's just like, "No." And he starts to explain to this lady getting out with her children who the freedmen were. And this is not a freedman descendant. It's just like, what? I never heard of that.
Yeah.
You mean these are Black people? What is that? This is what is so important. This is a person from that very area also did not know this. And I'm sure that Verna, and I see some other Cherokee citizens in the room who probably could also go up to people and say, "Have you ever heard of Oklahoma freedmen?" But if you ask the same people who say no, "Have you heard of the Trail of Tears?" "Oh yeah, I've heard of that. That was such a sad story." This is why we do what we're doing. This is why we descend from those individuals. As I said, 20,766 people were classified as freedmen from 5 tribal nations, all with records to
And
back it.
I'm concerned by you saying 5.
Yes,
We got some tribes that ain't even accounted for. You're only talking about 5.
absolutely
Goodness.
correct. Absolutely
Goodness.
correct.
It's almost overwhelming.
It is
the fact
overwhelming
it's
because
it's hidden. It's hidden.
it has been omitted for so long. Yesterday,
Yeah.
we had a fabulous conversation in our chat. We had a woman visiting us from Canada and from Western Canada whose family
Mhm.
emigrated to Western Canada in the early 20th century. But because it had been a century since her folks were still in Oklahoma, she really knew nothing. And we were able
Right.
to take her family back to
Wow.
the mid 1800s. And of course, she was overjoyed. We were overjoyed. We were excited because we were doing our genealogy thing.
Sure.
But what was interesting to me was that, wow, what a difference a century can do to your
Can do.
memory, to the
Sure.
family's memory of
Sure.
its history. And of course, now, in terms of looking at freedmen descendants, many of
Mhm.
whom have been fighting for the last 35 to 40 years to get back into
Mhm.
the tribal nations of which their
Sure.
families, from which their families come. And yet, even historically, there are people within those nations today who don't know what we had slaves. They need to read
Yes.
this.
And I'm
now.
looking at pictures. I'm
And
looking
we
at
have
pictures.
images, and the book
Yes.
is full of images, beautiful portraits, amazing stories, not just
Yes.
on the cover, and records. And
Mhm.
we've got to study it. We've got to learn it. We've got to talk about it. I find it empowering. I'm honored that Sally's story kept nudging me for the
Correct.
last 30 plus years to tell it, to tell it, to
Mhm.
tell it. And hopefully, the more we tell it, more people will learn. And the history is such an incredible one of not just resistance, but
Sure.
resilience. And our people were resilient. And that is why we're writing. And we hope others will read it and join us on this journey.
Well, I love it. And I'm going to turn it over to Whitney to let us know if there's any questions in the Q&A, and then we will close this out right on time. And Whitney, if you're available there, let us know if there's some questions to the panelists, please.
Yes, we do have some questions for the panelists. So, Angela, when you were talking with the map and the allotted with the 40 acres, you said more people had more acres because they had blood. How did they determine who was blood?
Sometimes it was
Great
just
question.
sometimes that determination was based on the same method that the census enumerators put an M behind somebody's name and a B behind someone else's name. They would look at them and decide, oh, you don't have enough Indian blood. But others, oh, were you a slave? Even though you can read interviews where they needed an interpreter. They spoke no English. They needed an interpreter to speak on their behalf. But it turns out that they were Takalusa, meaning, oh, you're a Black Choctaw. Or as one of our contributing writers said, her grandfather, I think this was her grandfather here, where my finger is. And he used to tell her, Hatakalusa. And he would say that to her in Chickasaw. And she was like, what does that mean? And he would just kind of laugh. And it says, no, it means that you're Black. And that's pretty much what was always said in many circles. So it was determined sometimes on appearance, but once the questions and answers came forth, oh, you were a slave, even though the person could have had a native father or mother, they will tell you that they're strictly matrilineal, but that was not always the case. And yet, so freedmen were forced to wear the badge of slavery for time eternal. You, your descendants, just like in the days of enslavement, you've seen the records where, oh, Peggy and all of her issue will be slaves of this particular family. You know, those probate records.
And or future increase.
Her future increase. But now slaves were freed in the Treaty of 1866, the various treaties. But when it came to allotment, they were still forced to wear the badge of slavery. In the Choctaw and Chickasaw Nation, they were not treated equally, even in terms of amounts of land that were to be allotted to them. And even today, I was in the room when the representative from the Choctaw Nation said, oh, this is not about race. It's all about blood, with a room full of Black people sitting behind him, and many in that room who could prove that they had, their ancestor on the Dawes roll had a blood Indian parent. But the presence of their Black blood was seen as if it contaminated. What kind of, this is like apartheid, the past laws of South Africa. What in the world in this country? How is that concept allowed to thrive officially? And it does.
Or as the newspaper article said, the freedmen are trying to remove the taint of slavery. Okay, yeah.
As if we jumped on the auction block ourselves.
And so let's put it in terms that a genealogist would understand. That you descend from generation after generation after generation, and you don't take it from the mother or the father, you take it from both.
Right.
So in the case of determining your blood quantum, they indicated they took it from the mother, but there are many exceptions to that rule. But as a genealogist, we know we are the product of a mother and father and 4 grandparents and on and on and on and
so
on.
Forth. Yeah.
So it was excluded from the calculation only because they could determine you as being of African or African descent. And so when the lawyer for the Choctaw Nation got in front of the Senate and said it was not about race, he didn't put it in historical context. Because if you put it in a historical context, it's nothing but about race.
It's race. Yeah. Okay, Whitney, next question.
Can someone explain why someone would be moved from one role to another? For instance, this person who asked the question, they have a family member who shows up on the Chickasaw rolls, but then they were moved to the Choctaw rolls, if I said that correctly.
Choctaw. Yeah.
I'll attempt to, but what you'll see in a lot of the later Dawes cards, where they were trying to determine who was the last slave owner, whether they were a Chickasaw or Choctaw slave owner. And so based on that information, you would go on that particular freedman roll. And you'll see a lot of people who were on the Chickasaw roll who were later turned back or switched over to the Choctaw roll because their last slave owner was a Choctaw. For genealogical purposes, that's great because we're always looking for that last slave owner in order to find more records. So, but in the process, you will get probably a more in-depth interview than you would in others. So I would have welcomed one like that.
Because you have 2 files to go after.
Rabbit holes,
sure. That means more paper. Yes. Yes.
Well, I'm good for punishment. What can I say?
Is there any other one?
Yes, we have about 4 more.
Okay.
Where are the land deeds located for researching purposes?
The land allotment records are both on FamilySearch.org and on Ancestry as well. And they are the records that correspond to the Dawes cards. But they're sorted by roll number, not by card number. The interviews are sorted by card number. But if your ancestor's roll number, which is the number that's to the left of their name on that card, that's how you will find that allotment record. But both Family Search and Ancestry have those records.
So we're going to say thank you, Ancestry. Thank you, Family Search, for having those. Okay, Whitney.
Correct.
I see it. Okay, the number
on
right
the left
there.
side
And
here
that's
is
the roll number.
Roll number. That's how you would locate the land allotment record. And this is your field number, the Dawes card number. So this is how you find the interview record. or as
Got
we
it.
old folks like to call an M1301. And this card is an M1186, but that was in the year of microfilm, so we no longer
In
use
the
that.
microfilm years.
Digitized. You kids don't know what you're missing.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, Whitney.
Whitney,
Where
may
would
I,
you
may I
rec-
say something?
Yeah.
Back to the blood roll.
Mhm.
I mean, moving from one card to another. And especially since we have descendants of freedmen now being able to apply, they are recognizing that they are by blood.
Oh.
Mm,
And some,
okay.
for example, I have a granddaughter, and I'm just going to use her for example, who is Choctaw and on the Cherokee. So she is going to stay on the Choctaw roll because she's on the Choctaw by blood. But you can be dual citizens,
Okay.
which means you can be Cherokee, Choctaw, whatever. You can be a dual citizen, but usually it's going by the one that's by blood.
Well, you Cherokees are so liberal.
Okay.
Is
We
there
try.
is there somewhere you would recommend someone to find more info on the list of slaves that were on the Trail of Tears?
Lord.
There's no one spot to
No.
find, except when Terry's book comes out, we will
Yeah,
have
there you go. We'll have a streamline of one line,
Tell it,
2
Angela.
lines going through.
It's a lot of hard work, and I don't think everybody's made up for it. Okay.
Yeah.
But
I
right
mean,
now there is no composite
there
list,
isn't.
but
There isn't. You know,
he's
and,
working on it. So
and you know, and I'm trying to make decisions on where do you cut off the age of the person who might probably have been on the trail, as opposed to those who can definitely say we're on the trail. So it's not an easy
it's
thing
not
to
easy
determine.
process.
But all I can do is give you kind of a framework in which to work from, and some definitive stories of those who, like one of them I showed. The woman says, "Well, I came from Georgia with the old settlers." To me, that's a person that was on the trail. Okay, the old settlers of Georgia or Cherokee, and so I can say that for sure that person was on the trail. There are others I'd have to speculate on because their age fits the parameters, but without that statement, it's going to be difficult. So
Got it.
if they feel like they're up for the challenge, come on, join me.
So coming soon.
The water's deep.
Did the 5 tribes trade slaves with outside settler communities?
Some did. Sometimes you'll hear, or you may read an interview either from the Dawes card, the Dawes packet, or even in some of the pioneer interviews that were conducted in the 1930s. And someone may say, yes, I came with the Creeks, but I was later sold to a Cherokee. So you'll find that happened. But also, you had situations where you had slave catchers who were coming into some communities. That's one reason Seminoles, a group of Seminoles, left Indian Territory in 1848 and fled to Mexico because they were continually being raided. Their little settlements were being raided. People were snatching enslaved people to sell them to people in Texas. So you did have situations where there was some trading going on, of course. And then you have a case, I think Robert Jones, who was that big, large slaveholder in the Choctaw Nation, he would sometimes go down to New Orleans and bring some slaves back with him. So not as frequently among other slaveholders, but that did happen. So
Okay.
I'm working with one story, and I'm not morbid, but it hits all the bells and whistles of telling people how people got to Indian Territory. And it's not first-hand story, it's a second-hand story about this guy's mother who was being sold on the auction block with a child. And as she was being taken to Indian Territory by a slave driver, her mother is left there weeping because she realizes she'll never see her daughter or her grandchild again. And then she's sold to a Choctaw Indian who, when further research shows, he fathered children by 4 different enslaved women.
Oh, wow.
Well, one, that's kind of the only story we have of someone actually walking on the trail with some of the details to it.
Mm-hmm.
And then you also get the backstory of the life of these women who were abused. okay, and had no power in order to refuse this man. And so, but he's a prominent doctor within the Choctaw Nation. Okay.
Mhm.
Now,
Got it.
to a lot of people, that's a story you don't want to touch, but it has to be told because
Sure.
it gives you a fair assessment and view of the society, the culture, and the happenings that were going on,
Mhm.
and those effects that I will contend are still with us today.
Yes. Yes. Thank you for that. Whitney?
What type of documents did the Choctaw keep for slaves?
That
like-
is something, okay, that's something that you're not going to find a good answer to that because number one, as we think of traditional research, even if you're researching enslaved ancestors, oh, well, go to the courthouse. Did they have to pay taxes on them? What happened? Are there newspapers that talk about a big auction that's coming up, or are there some plantation records? There are very few plantation records that you're going to find at all, if any, from Indian territory. Number one, everyone did not own 200, 300, 400 enslaved people like Robert Jones did. If I look
Mhm.
in the Scullyville community and Sugarloaf communities where my folks lived, I see that most people owned 5, 6 enslaved people, sometimes less. Sometimes you find, for example, I can know that within the Perry family, that was part of the family that my family belonged to. You'll see each one of the Perry members, they each had one slave each, but this was an entire family of people. I can name, oh, that's okay, that's probably great great grandma Kitty. Oh, okay, there's Amanda. Oh, that little child, that might be Sally. You find small slaveholders in general.
Right, right.
So during that time period, you're not going to find a plethora of records. Also, as Terry pointed out earlier, that doesn't fit the narrative. Slaveholders having
Mhm.
documents that are presented to the
Mhm.
public in terms of enslaved people, when again, that's going to shatter another image of these poor people lost their land in Mississippi. So let's not put up too many things that are going to show the slaves that they took with them.
Mhm.
So they just don't exist in the same
The same way.
degree that you find them in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, and other
Mhm.
places.
Yeah, I think that's part of the challenge. And lucky for me, I'm stupid this way. I like the challenge. You know,
Yeah.
that you're trying to determine a story of people who didn't write their own narrative. You
Mhm.
have to read between the lines. I think it also kind of alludes to the fact that we need a oral history project for those people who are seniors and elders
Yeah.
now, because they had an opportunity to have firsthand knowledge of an original Dawes enrollee. You know, the Congress is giving out millions of dollars to these tribes to preserve their history. They're not giving us a dime to preserve the
Nothing.
At
same history.
all.
You know, and then that's tragedy. And it's tragic. And again, it continues to enforce the invisibility of the people and their history.
And you're
So,
woven in there, but you're being left
oh,
out.
yeah, I mean,
Invisibility. Absolutely.
if
Absolutely.
it was me and I had power, you know, I would look at the percentage of people who were enslaved and as a population, and whatever money goes to that tribe, that certain percentage should come back to those enslaved descendants,
Okay.
so they can preserve and talk about their own history. It just boggles my mind that you could be that insensitive to this story, but be so sensitive to the other.
Mhm.
It doesn't compute with me.
And Whitney, is there one last question? Because I know we have went over
yeah.
time and I don't want to keep folks,
It-
and so we can close out. Is there one more question?
Yeah,
we
because
can
I didn't
get
have
it?
my breakfast, Angela.
Oh,
Well, I think maybe the best thing to end is what's the best way for people to contact you if they have
thank
further more
you.
questions and to learn more?
If Angela or someone will put
Okay.
contact information in the chat, I'll go ahead and close this out for
I can do
folks.
that.
Can you do that, Angela? And
I can
one
do
of the
that.
things, will you
I'm
put
doing
the
it right now.
Facebook information? If it's a public group or something where people could
Yes.
get more information, put those links. links in there?
There are
as
several
well?
groups, but all people are welcome to join the group that I monitor, which is the Choctaw. I'm getting a mouth twist here.
That
The,
was Whitney's influence there.
I'll
the
drink to that.
Choctaw, Chickasaw Freedmen
Yeah.
Descendants group on Facebook. There are 3 questions that you will have to answer. If you don't answer the preliminary questions, you won't be admitted. It's just something that we use
Right.
to just say it's your interest, a sincere interest. So by all means, join that group, the Choctaw. Well, it's not it's just Choctaw Chickasaw Freedmen Descendants.
Got it.
And certainly do that. I'm also putting in the
Verna
chat.
put hers in there too.
Okay,
and
I'm putting my
Terry.
email, AY Walton-Raji.
Okay, well, first, let me be the one, and Whitney and I and Brian Sheffy and the rest of us at the Center for Family History at the International African American Museum, we do want to thank you. I mean, we have went past our time, but I think it was well worth it. I think there was some very critical information that came out, and hopefully folks will continue to check out the monthly webinars that we're offering. And also next month for December, on December the 9th at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, the topic will be historical footprints, ancestral echoes, and that's the interplay of historical and lineage societies coming together and how they work together. We'll have Rick Murphy from the Society of the First African American Families in English America, Dr. Evelyn McDowell from the Sons and Daughters of the U.S. Middle Passage, and LaJoy Mosley, who is the president of the Afro-American Historical Genealogical Society. And again, join us. We'll have that registration is actually up on the iaamuseum.org page right now under the Center for Family History. And again, thank you to the panelists. Thank you, Whitney, for being here with us. And everyone have a good weekend.